I think the naivety is a superpower. Not knowing what you don't yet know, it can be the thing that intimidates folks, but actually, especially when you're creating something new, can really, really help disarm some of the traditionalism that exists in the world already.
Imagine 18,000 pounds of waste showing up at the stoop of your walk-up New York City apartment. Well, that's exactly what happened to Max and Natalie at Bala Bangles. The company's now called Bala, and they sell stylish fitness products. It's an incredible business that's grown tremendously. This conversation with Max is amazing. He's extremely thoughtful. We talk about deconstructing overwhelming tasks, the gift of feedback and how to not take it too seriously, how to work with celebrity investors, and most importantly, we talk about a very specific buying mistake that Max made early on with Bala that he learned from and grew from that you can avoid. I really love this episode. There's a lot to learn. Ladies and gentlemen, Max from Bala. Max, welcome to What to Do Next. Excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
You built an incredible business. Congratulations. Before we dive into it, I got a lot of questions for you. I think you guys have learned a ton along the way that'll benefit so many founders out there. Tell us a little bit about Bala Bangles, how it started, how it's going, and what's got you excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that don't know, Bala is a sort of design-led approach to fitness equipment and accessories. And when you kind of juxtapose that with the category standard, you think of all black, hyper-masculine, intimidating gym environments. And, we've really focused on building a playful and irreverent brand that kind of invites people in. And so the products are quite colorful and the brand sentiment is really kind of non-serious. And we found that that's really disruptive for the space. So, we'd started the business as an intended side project 8.5 years ago at this point with my then girlfriend, now wife, Natalie. At the time we were singularly focused on redesigning and reintroducing wrist and ankle weights that were ubiquitous in the 80s, but had sort of fallen off the fitness consciousness, if you will, in the decades that followed. They sort of died with, leg warmers and jazzercise. So, terrible business idea to try to reprise a product that folks were no longer using. But what we'd found is that there was this real appetite for beautiful, thoughtfully designed equipment, because folks were dressing up to go to really amazing gym environments, and the products that they were using in those spaces were really sort of under-designed and uninspired. So that's kind of, in a very, very brief nutshell, who we are and how we got started.
And I mean, you guys have grown it tremendously. You were originally, I think, in the ad business, right?
Yeah, so I spent 10 plus years working at agencies, on behalf of big global brands, so agencies are kind of necessarily anonymous, right? You might not have heard of 72 and Sunny, which is the agency that Natalie and I most recently worked at together and ultimately met and fell in love at. So, kudos to 72, but you do know the brands that they represent. So anyone from Google, Starbucks, Target, Jeep, etc. I have no idea if they still hold those accounts, but that was sort of the bigger ones at the time.
So take us back to betting outside your lane. You're an ad agency guy. You decide to start a business with your girlfriend. She's going to handle the creative. You're going to handle operations and back office. What's going through your head at that time? What did you have to learn quick?
Yeah, I always stress this to folks because, now 8 years in, we know a hell of a lot more than we did at the time. But this idea that there is a right and wrong way and sort of the optimized way to make virtually every decision in business, I think is a bit of a red herring, right? And so what was true then remains true now, but we have a hell of a lot more sort of battle scars to make sense of key decisions. And really, we didn't know what we didn't know, right? I think we'd had this willingness to try to figure it out. And there's any number of sort of bad anecdotes about this, but it's like, you might not know how to sell your car, but you might know how to take pictures of it or have it cleaned. And, basically every big, overwhelming task can be deconstructed into manageable ones. And so stepping outside our lane at the time, wasn't as scary as starting this giant business. It was like, hey, we have a working idea and a sketch on a napkin that really was born from and really sort of underwhelming yoga class. It was like really meditative, and we wanted to, burn some calories and, all of that, really sort of push ourselves. And we just left feeling like there's got to be a way to control the intensity of class-based workouts. And so we'd actually sketched what was really representative of what Bala would become on a napkin in the hour that followed this class. But again, it wasn't necessarily about scaling this entire mountain. It was about just taking the first couple of steps. And, for us, what that looked like was refining the design, translation, drawing it a few more times, rendering that design in 3D. And then, there were obviously steps associated with sourcing manufacturers, ops, logistics, everything that follows. But again, you didn't have to do it all in a day. And so Natalie and I really just committed to taking those baby steps early. And like I said, even today, we continue to run into things we're not entirely sure how to do on a daily, if not weekly basis, and kind of try to bring that same ethic, kind of a learner's mentality to those otherwise unknowns.
Hi, I'm David. I'm the president of Highbeam. But before that, I built a brand called David's Tea from 0 to 200 million in sales, and I took it public on the NASDAQ. Highbeam is a banking and cash management platform for consumer brands. It's the bank I wish I had when I was building David's Tea. We'll turn banking from a cost center for you today into a profit center for you tomorrow. We'll make you better cash back on ad spend. We'll maximize your yield on idle working capital through daily automated sweeps. And we have a host of AI-powered tools to save you a boatload of time. Check us out at highbeam.com and let's talk. It's a really interesting concept. I mean, you touch on two things. One is how being naive can actually be beneficial. I mean, I had the same thing with David's Tea. The scope of what it would be like to run a team, multiple stores, allocation, planning, cash flow decisions, etc. I don't know that I would have done it.
Without a doubt. Honestly, I think the naivety is a superpower. And I suppose conversely, we've all been in rooms with those folks that act as though they're the smartest person in the room, and it's rarely true, right? And so I think confidence is one thing, and we have tremendous confidence in what we're building and a real discipline to sort of the brand and product standards. So those are the single source of truth, but it's not an ego-driven business or pursuit. And so to your point, yeah, I think naivety, not knowing what you don't yet know, it can be the thing that intimidates folks, but actually, especially when you're creating something new, can really, really help, sort of disarm some of the traditionalism that exists, in the world already.
And did you guys, it sounds like you ran it fairly bootstrapped at the start. I mean, we'll get to your Shark Tank moment, but, it sounds like you basically took one foot in front of the other and thought about what the next decision was and just didn't spend money you didn't have.
It just goes back, that too is an ethic we've tried to hang on to over the years, even as we've scaled. The early idea was, let's do this on nights and weekends. Let's see if we can bring a consumer product to market. And these aren't small goals. These are, a lot of folks will tell you actually getting to launch is arguably one of the harder parts about building a business from the ground up. And, the reality is, we really never thought it was going to go anywhere. We did a Kickstarter for the very first production run, which got us the $40K necessary to buy 3,000 units. Those 3,000 units, mind you, they're wrist weights. So they're 2 pounds each. That's 6,000 pounds. Were delivered to our Brooklyn apartment where we'd had to walk them up 3 flights of stairs. And then when we placed orders, we had to walk them back down in this like industrial bag that I would carry a few blocks to the post office. So it was lean by necessity.
So you guys, you designed it, a couple of cocktail napkins, and it's on paper, then it's in a CAD file. I'm assuming you call up on Alibaba or whatever to try and find a manufacturer. You Kickstarter this, you get them to make 3,000 units or 18,000 pounds. It shows up at the basement of your apartment building.
Yeah, we had freight deliver a couple pallets of Bangles. We were living in Brooklyn in Dumbo at the time, and they left them on the sidewalk and said, sign this. Here you go. And I think I still have some early pictures of Nat and I, in our apartment with half of it allocated to the Bangles that we just ordered.
And are you excited at this point, or is this a holy shit moment?
I think there's so many holy shit moments, and we're still having them. I think it's part of what keeps it fun, for us and presumably most entrepreneurs, is that every day you start the day with holy shit, everything's breaking. And then, on the better days, you end the day with saying, wow, it feels like things are finally working. We're finally hitting our stride. And sometimes that happens a few times throughout the day. But yeah, at the time we were excited. We didn't really know what we had yet. We'll surely talk about what Bala ultimately becomes, but I think we thought the idea had merit, but with no delusion of it's being this absolute home run. And I suppose, spoiler alert, we've now sold north of 3 million, maybe 3.5 million pairs of those same Bangles. So, we'd only ever imagined selling through the first 3,000, quite frankly.
You wake up in the morning and you have a massive holy shit moment most days. And I mean, I always frame it as entrepreneurship is like walking through quicksand and chewing broken glass most of the time. How do you think about being proactive versus being reactive, where you're constantly being bombarded with the fires du jour, some of which, but there's this balance, right? Like you have to be reactive, but you also have an agenda that you've walked into the day with. How do you think about that? And how's that played out for you and evolved as you've sort of grown in your career?
There are certain eventualities in our process that we have now built into our process, right? And so there's more checks and balances. It's a more sort of thorough checklist, whether it exists on paper or in our own heads. We are more prepared than we've ever been. But then there's this sort of Murphy's Law of it all, where shit hits the fan, things go wrong, and that happens more than you could ever imagine outside looking in, right? And so, as it relates to those sorts of things, I think we've really just embraced this mantra of sort of resilience. And I'm regularly telling myself the only way out is through. Right? These things don't get done unless I do them or delegate them, right? And so there's an imperviousness that you develop, a callousness, if you will, to what seemed like big issues to me 8 years ago, are no longer there. It's a blip in the radar, right? And so, yeah, you just become, as with anything, you just become better at navigating those things in as unemotional a way as possible. I'll tell you that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of knockoffs and derivative brands. Those brands continue to hit me right in the heart on a daily basis. It's as if it's the very first time every time. But with that exception, I think we're just a little bit more used to it.
Knockoff is a form of flattery. How has it impacted your business? Has it really been a drag on your business, or has it just made you more the real thing?
It's tough to say. We made an early decision to build a brand, right? And again, if you think of fitness equipment and accessories, it was a largely commoditized space. Anyone and everyone had resistance bands with their logo on them, right? No one knew the brand of the dumbbells that they were working out with, particularly in an analog fitness space, right? There's obviously the Pelotons of the world, that built brands in a digital capacity, but almost more like tech companies than fitness companies, right? And so it's a really commoditized category. So when we found success with Bangles, anyone and everyone has copied them. And I genuinely meant everyone, from the offshore counterfeits that don't care at all about brand to very serious brands that have made derivative products just different enough to circumvent our design patent. And so it's hard for me to really quantify the degree to which they have hurt our business. I don't know that it's a situation that it's building or lifting the category. Quite frankly, while Bala is sort of culturally resonant and growing, I think we're still a relatively small fish here. So I don't necessarily know that folks are choosing the knockoff instead of Bala. But again, this is all really like speculative and anecdotal. We've never like taken a deep breath and really run the numbers because I think it would be too crippling.
And do you have a patent on it? No, right?
Well, we have a patent on our Bangles. I should say that we have developed, 30 more products, and there are 30 more on the way. And really, our contribution to the space is that we've made products more beautiful in their design, but also higher quality in their materials. So nobody was using silicone overmolding before Bala entered this space. You take something like our Power Ring. It's a ring. It's like a weighted steering wheel, basically. It's a ring-shaped free weight. It's so simple a concept, but it didn't otherwise exist. And you think of the ergonomics of a kettlebell or a dumbbell, which really isn't designed to be held with both hands. So when a mat-based workout calls for a weighted prop, there wasn't really a great solution. And so we brought forth the simplest possible concept. The challenge from an IP perspective, and this is where the USPTO can be incredibly frustrating, is a ring-shaped weight looks a lot like a donut, or the weight you put on a baseball bat when you're on deck, right? And so basically a lot of our design contributions are not protectable because there are adjacencies that look a lot like what we use, even if the intended use is wildly different.
And if I'm a founder listening to this and I've got a product that's fairly unique and innovative, but do I bother getting the patent and going through all of that and defending it? Or do I just move on and sell and focus on building great product and marketing it?
It's a really great question. I would say do what you can early, early and broadly, right? So we were able to secure a domestic design patent for Bala Bangles, which remains our hero product. We didn't know at the time, for all the reasons we've discussed already, that, design patents aren't global, right? And so a lot of the knockoffs are coming from China, and there's just like kind of degrees of separation from someone that buys those and puts their own logo on them from a manufacturer that is kind of knowingly knocking you off, right? And so I would advise, if it's patentable, absolutely patent it, whether that's design or utility, and then do what you can to extend those patents in key markets. If nothing else, do so where, manufacturing for that product is most likely, because then you can at least cut them off at the source. For us, we're mostly protective of the US because that's 95% of our business today. But hindsight 2020, I would have absolutely extended the Bangles patent. We've tried to patent virtually every product we've created, but again, you just kind of run up to this really reductive rationale for why, patents get passed or not.
All right. So 3,000 units go out the door. You just got ridiculously buff, moving 1,800 pounds up and down stairs. What happens next? Talk to us about how this blows up.
Yeah, look, I think it wasn't a growth strategy. It was a, how do we, sell off those that we'd ordered? And I would say that we were really experimental in our approach, right? So we didn't want to force feed folks this idea that was like, an 80s inspired concept and just skin it like it was 1985 and start promoting it accordingly. We'd really sort of tried different things on social, and the day that we'd posted someone wearing high heels while also wearing Bala Bangles on their ankles was like it was relatively small sample size at that time, but people either absolutely loved it or absolutely hated it. And we'd realized that no one had really necessarily spoken to the entirety of someone's fitness and fashion self, in the same breath, right? And we were making beautiful weights that could be worn, proudly, right? That didn't need to be relegated to the basement or closet when not in use. And in fact, when folks leave them out because they're inherently well designed, they're actually more inclined to use them as a result. And so it was on that discovery that we'd started to bring focus to where and how these could sell. So our early adopters from a retail perspective were the likes of Goop, Free People, Anthropology, really sort of like, not what you would typically think of as like your traditional fitness retailer. And I should say also that, there was a romance associated with direct to consumer businesses, a decade ago. And because of the very humble sort of beginnings of Bala, we just wanted to get them out, right? We sort of rationalized that if these were on Goop, they would bring credibility to a brand that folks didn't otherwise know about. And we'd at least recoup our costs and obviously make some margin on the sale. So there was a sort of omni-channel approach from day one that included traditional wholesale retail, direct-to-consumer on our website. We launched on Amazon shortly after our launch on Shopify. And then we were also getting into sort of yoga, Pilates, and dance studios from a very early, very early days there.
How important is it to know who your customer isn't? And talk to me about, this expression, you're nobody till someone hates you. How valuable was that for you?
I would say it was incredibly valuable and kind of foundational to the brand we ultimately built. It felt like we struck a chord we didn't otherwise know was there, but in retrospect made a hell of a lot of sense, right? Like fashion brands have only ever talked to you as though you're the world's most fashionable person, that you walk the streets as if you're walking the runway. And then on the other hand, fitness brands have only ever spoken to folks as if they're aspiring to be the next Olympian, right? And I understand why LeBron's in the Nike ad, but it's not always inspiring me to go play pickup basketball, when my knees hurt and I'm struggling to find the motivation to get off the couch at the end of a long day. And so by blurring the lines and bringing them together, that really was represented in that kind of divisive social post and ultimately informed who the brand is today. So yeah, it's immensely kind of important moment for us.
Some founders look at the people with the negative comments and try and adjust the brand to please everyone.
Yeah, not for us. I should say it's like the intensity with which folks like weighed in. It matters the degree to which people care. You know what I mean? Why I'm like losing the saying, but it's like love me or hate me, just talk about me kind of thing, right? Exactly that. Yeah. Don't love me or hate me, but like don't just like be indifferent, And I think so. We leaned in because we'd realized there was a tension, and it's though we really lean into that kind of fashion sensibility of the brand, I wouldn't say that the brand today is all that controversial or divisive, but I think we'd realized that there was maybe this niche that sat between two categories that weren't otherwise talking to one another that we could really lean into. And, I will say of the last 8-10 years, it's really trended that way. You see Hermes doing like, fitness leaning lines and content. And then similarly, you see fitness brands kind of drafting off of some of the comms that we've crafted over the years. And it looks like we had it in our crystal ball, at times.
So business is growing. You guys are running mostly D2C channels. You got a few wholesale accounts. You guys end up on Shark Tank, but what are you guys thinking? You're at this point, you still have a day job, I believe, right?
We white knuckled our day jobs for a couple of years. Just as we didn't yet know where it was heading, we weren't taking salary from it. Every dollar that we'd made was reinvested. And so, I think in year one, we did something around $250K worth of sales in like a 6-month period, which was encouraging. And then in year two, we were on pace to do just over 2 million. And we were really sort of comfortable with that growth rate because, again, it's not as if we started this business with this beautifully designed, perfectly articulated deck about how we were going to change the world. This was really an iterative sort of learning process. And it was late in 2019 that we had an opportunity to go film for Shark Tank. And what ended up happening is our episode aired in late February of 2020, 2 weeks before, the NBA shut down and Tom Hanks got COVID in the same day, which, I continue to feel was like the day that, the US started taking COVID seriously. And, folks looked for ways to stay fit from home. So we had this incredible media moment, just while there was this growing consumer need. And obviously, I'm like tabling the tragic circumstances of the pandemic. We too were terrified and sheltered in place. But all of a sudden, demand for the product grew and grew and grew and, kept growing. I should say ever since, but, mostly ever since.
Why Shark Tank? Like, were you guys like, hey, we should go on Shark Tank? That's the next logical step.
No, I think we were just sort of like embracing everything the business brought us. And, Shark Tank is sort of synonymous with entrepreneurship. And so anyone and everyone will say, oh, you've got a business idea, you should go on Shark Tank, as if it's so easy to get on in the first place. And, it was like applying for a prestigious college. Like it was rounds and rounds of interviews, dozens, if not hundreds of pages worth of, inputs in terms of their kind of due diligence requirements. So, we said, let's try to do this. It wasn't as if it was the complete effort or that we were, going all in on Shark Tank. We just said, this is the right kind of business for Shark Tank because it's demonstrable. Folks can touch and feel and interact with the product that we believed was really high quality. And, spoiler alert, it went really well for us. All 5 sharks were essentially fighting over the business. Everyone made offers. Cuban and Maria Sharapova kind of remain our partners to this day.
Which is rare. Most of these deals don't actually happen off camera when you get into due diligence. What was that process like?
Yeah, so it was interesting, largely because the premise of the show is that we're all very, very early stage entrepreneurs. And I think this show has evolved over the years, so that's maybe not as true today as it was then. But we were completely unprepared for the due diligence that followed. We needed to retain legal counsel. We needed to really strengthen our bookkeeping that was, on Google Sheets exclusively at the time. We weren't totally clear on where we were in the process at any given stage. But ultimately, we did feel that having Mark and Maria involved would be like a meaningful asset well beyond the airing of the episode. And so, yeah, there's plenty of folks that, go on for the exposure. I don't think it's like a poorly kept secret. In our case, they've been great partners to us. And, it's a deal that I think they'll be proud of as well, given the sort of growth of the company.
I'm actually super curious about that. I mean, celebrity investors in the moment, they can feel like a real win and they're validating, certainly, but often it's hard to get value out of them after the fact once they're on the cap table. How have you managed to get them to deliver the value that you guys were hoping for? You went into it.
There is like a graciousness of the two of them on a more personal level that I didn't expect. Maria is a genuine fan of the brand and products and is a great kind of representation of this sort of fashion fitness mashup that we've talked about already. And so she's voluntarily been in photo shoots. She's sent product to like her Rolodex of A-list celebrities, right? And a lot of that has been to her credit on her own accord. I think we're equally sensitive not to ask too much of these folks that are immensely successful in dozens, if not hundreds of different pursuits. But, and I should say Mark equally, it's like amazing. If I were to email Mark now, I bet he would get back to me by the end of this call, right? And so he's just the world's most efficient man, and so there has been this kind of generosity from them well beyond, the investment that we'd really allocated to inventory and blew through in, months after their investment. So I can't speak, to all investors, celebrity or otherwise, but in this case, these folks have been really great to us.
It sounds like the lesson. It's like the Seth Godin thing: 1,000 true fans. Like you need the celebrity. It has to be authentic, where they truly are a fan of the brand.
Totally. And look, I mean, there's no delusion of their going out and selling on our behalf, right? I think that there is a little bit of if the expectation is that, celebrity and endorsement or investment is going to transform your business, I think that's probably misguided, right? But, if you have connected folks that are true advocates of yours, there are choice moments in our journey where they've helped immensely, whether Mark's told us, hey, don't do that thing that you've talked about doing, which he's said before. And in hindsight, he was absolutely right. And, these are like tough pills in the moment. And you go, oh, this guy's been there, done that.
Can you tell us the mistake you almost made?
Well, we had an early inventory mistake. We had a retailer that was really opportunistic in the pandemic. And he said, it's awesome that you're getting all these POs, but, pump the brakes, because you're still on the hook for this inventory, in an RTV, return to vendor capacity. He was absolutely right. And we did not heed that advice. There's also been some more, ambitious product, expansion ideas that he rightfully expressed concern. I won't go into the specifics, but we did heed that advice. So we sort of learned our lesson that Mark knows best.
So you guys got excited either with the ability to expand products, beyond your core SKUs, or it sounds like worse, retailers saying, yeah, we want to order all this product. We're not going to pay you for it yet, but you go make the orders on your end, and you guys got stiff with a lot of product.
Yeah, essentially, in the case of the retailer, Bala was absolutely exploding in the pandemic. They bought into, millions. I think it was north of $5 million worth of product, and we just hadn't proven it out that much yet. The packaging was, you couldn't even tell what the product was, right? So we were just in our absolute infancy, and we weren't ready. I think today we would enthusiastically take it and know where the potential pitfalls were, but at the time, like we said, naivety can be a strength, but in this case it was nearly our downfall, quite frankly.
Let's go back there, because I mean that's a real what to do next moment. So you've just ordered millions of dollars of inventory, which at the time I'm sure was a big stretch for you guys. And the retailer calls you and is like, hey, Max, it's not selling. I'm canceling POs. Essentially,
yeah. There was a kind of comedy of errors, right? Because the orders were the biggest we'd ever received, multiple of what we were currently producing. And so we had cancel dates, which are, the deadlines by which you need to ship POs. And they were flighting those POs over the course of a few months, right, to stock and then replen the product that ended up on shelf. And basically, we didn't have production capacity at the time, right? So we were accepting these POs, we were pushing those POs, and so that everything ultimately hit at once far later than it should have. So the product sold, but not at the rate the POs were flighted at, particularly when we'd sort of compressed that delivery timeline. So it actually wasn't necessarily the retailer's fault. We kind of contributed to this issue. I mean, hindsight 2020, I'd have said, let's cut these in half or a third and see how it does and then scale from there. But like I said, we weren't there yet. We, just did, there is a hard fought lesson associated with, one of the hardest things to navigate in in entrepreneurship is success, not failure, right? And it's expensive to grow and fund that growth. And cash flow will always be an immense challenge, whether you're doing $1 million or $100 million, right? And so this was one of those lessons and early indications that, even when things were going well or seemed to be going well, there was the other side to that coin there as well.
And how, from that experience, which I'm sure was one heck of a fire to have to put out over an extended period of time, how do you prepare for success now?
Yeah, I think that, fortunately, some of the issues that plagued us then just no longer exist today. So we have the necessary capacity with our suppliers. We have production redundancy, meaning we're producing product at more than one supplier, so that if we do get a big kind of opportunistic buy, we're able to, produce that without cannibalizing our existing stock. And so we built some like infrastructure and processes that help protect us from making those same mistakes. And yeah, I think that the other thing that I should say is that, we have some products that do exceptionally well in studio environments, for example, but do considerably worse on shelf at a mass retailer, right? And often we'll have that retailer go, we want your Bala bars, which are our pill-shaped hand weights. This is another one of those products that, we tried to patent, and now you just see like hundreds, if not thousands of them that are not Bala. They just don't sell as well at shelf on at a Target, for example. So now, instead of just sort of going, oh, cool, we'll accept these POs blindly, we're engaging in a dialogue, making sure that there's confidence associated with the assortment that ultimately goes on shelf. And then everything's negotiable. So we're also, to the degree that we can, we're saying, what is the RTV allowance? What level of sell-through do we need to get to and clear before, we're no longer on the hook for returns. It's a kind of oversimplification because retailers are really idiosyncratic, but that's the sort of mental math that we approach.
Right. So you basically, the pact you try and make with them is, look, if we prove that this is a steady seller on your shelves, we want you to de-risk our inventory buys for us where you can't give it back to us.
Yeah, exactly. In a nutshell.
And all of these lessons came out of the pain of the mistake that Mark Cuban said, guys, I don't know.
All of them, yes. And what's funny is we're working with that retailer again, and these are just it's part of it. You're gonna learn these sorts of lessons one way or the other, and actually the harder situations, provided you can navigate through them, are often more educational.
Right, you learn more from your failures and successes,
without a doubt. Yeah,
you start a business with your girlfriend, who becomes your wife. You guys have 3 kids together. That's hard. I mean, division of labor, when you're not allowed to talk about work. Like, if I'm listening to this and I'm going into business with my girlfriend and my spouse, what tips would you have?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think with Natalie and I, in the very early days, we were both sure that we knew the right answer for virtually every challenge, right? And the reality was neither of us knew, right? We had never otherwise run a business. This was our very first business, very first product. Everything was new. And I think over the years, where we found success is establishing very distinct sort of swim lanes, very clear division of labor. What are the decisions that she, is solely responsible for? What are the sorts of things that we come together on, and vice versa? And so that's been a real strength. I will say the separation of church and state, work and home life is easier said than done, because we sort of live, sleep, breathe this business. Eat, sleep, breathe, rather. So, we'll say, hey, I'm just not trying to talk about work. Inevitably, it upsets the other person. So not a perfect solution, but, that sort of Bala is part of our lives. The entirety of our dating life, we've been working on this business. So, in a lot of ways, it's our very first kid amongst the other three.
Is there such thing as an entrepreneur's work-life balance? Is that like a real thing, you think?
On the one hand, I will say that you get a lot more flexibility, not always, but the business can yield that. And I think that we have tried to grow thoughtfully and sustainably. So we've not chased hyper growth. I don't need to work at midnight. I certainly can, but I don't need to. So there is some freedom and flexibility, but there's probably not a hell of a lot of balance, at least for me personally, or any of the other entrepreneurs I know.
Somebody used the phrase work-life harmony, which is sort of a euphemism for you're always working.
Very diplomatic. I like it. I'll use that.
I think you started with the name Bangles. When did you drop the Bangles sort of and go with Bala? And what went into that decision?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So the early idea was that we would focus on yoga and Pilates, right? Like weighted yoga using dumbbells to sort of intensify a session or a practice was common. But, yoga is very expressive. You're using your hands, whether you're on the floor doing plank, whether you're like in, warrior 1 or warrior 2. I mean, it's like the full expression of these poses is through the hands. And so we'd felt that the use of dumbbells was interruptive to that flow and really kind of limited your practice. And so we sort of said, we love the idea of calling them Bangles, and we want the name to be alliterative. So what's a B word? And we looked at Sanskrit, which is the yogic language, and Bala translates to strength. So quite literally, these were strength bangles. And we liked the idea of sort of redefining what strength looked like. And so it wasn't long after the launch of Bala, probably when we were looking at sequel products about a year and a half later, that we'd said, Bala Bangles is going to pigeonhole us. And actually, Bala is fun to say. It's like directionally on point with what we want to stand for as a company. And so we decided to drop Bangles. Everyone still calls us Bala Bangles. So I think we'll never totally clear it. And, that's okay, because that's often how folks come to know us in the first place.
When did you guys say time to quit our jobs?
So Natalie went full time on Bala about a year before I did. I think it was after the Shark Tank airing that I went full time on it as well. What was cool is there's all this talk about taking a leap of faith and quitting your job and pursuing your passion. My day job basically funded that in the absence of any institutional capital or angel investment. So Shark Tank sort of allowed for me to then step away at that point with a higher degree of confidence that it was a safe bet. Probably had a job for the first 2.5 years of Bala.
And would you change that looking back in hindsight, or would you have gone full time sooner? Or how should I think about that? I'm a founder listening to this, trying to decide when to turn it from side hustle to main pursuit.
I feel like I read or hear a lot about, taking the leap. And I think that really needs to be more idiosyncratic to your situation, right? And in my case, I think it was absolutely necessary for us, to have a steady income whilst working on the business. And we didn't yet know what it was going to become. So it could have been a blip, and then we'd, be unemployed, which would have been, a problematic situation. So no, I like the way it went down for us. I will say that there's no real right way to do it. You said early, this was bootstrapped and a real grassroots effort. Certainly someone else might have taken this, raised, some VC money and blown it out of the water. They might be a bigger company than we are today. They'd likely own considerably less than we do. And there's a hell of a lot of ways to skin the business cat here.
Well, it brings us full circle. I mean, you started by saying, there's no right or wrong way. And it is an interesting way to think about it. Often in business, we think way too binary.
Oh, without a doubt. I know. I'm always on these or I've been on panels where there are these like leading questions as if, your one answer is meant to unlock, all of these sort of like very clear next steps, that there's an order of operations for absolutely everything. And so whenever I can, I try to sort of dispel that a bit because we're finding success with an intuitive, thoughtful, strategic approach, but not one that's just, reading off the playbook of those that came before us. Certainly involves that, from time to time, but I think that's part of what makes this so fun.
Max, you're an extremely thoughtful guy. It's a total pleasure to be able to interview you. We end with a couple of sort of lightning round questions. What's a decision you're wrestling with right now?
I think the decision almost always for me is how aggressive we get on inventory. Because having too much inventory is problematic because you have cash tied up in it. Having too little is problematic because you're sold out and, leaving money on the table. And so this is sort of a constant struggle for me.
Yeah, there's an expression, you always buy too much or too little. So how do you think about it? I mean, at David's Tea, we were very careful because we'd been burnt, to test and then reorder and really build up volumes carefully. Do you guys think the same way? Like, we would rather sell out early on than have too much. How do you think about inventory buys and how's that maybe evolved?
Genuinely, it sounds a very like a similar approach. For anything new, we buy it minimum order quantity. And then we can always build from there. There is a seasonality to our business and we continue to have these like great media moments, whether they're through brand partners or Bala showing up on a, popular TV show or a celebrity posting about it that we wouldn't otherwise be aware of. And so we find ourselves sold out quite frequently. And so, it's art and science. You can use historicals to project, the next run. But, when you're balancing all the other investments and line items that running the business requires, you can't have too much cash in inventory. So we don't have a perfect solution. That's why it's, the thing.
That's the art.
Yeah. I continue to struggle with.
Last question. Finish this sentence. Every founder building something new should. Now, I realize we just talked about not being binary and having a right or wrong answer, but if there's some general broad strokes, what do you think it is?
Get as much feedback on it as you can and don't take any of it too seriously, right? Because early opinions, even from loved ones, my very best friend in the world also has a very successful consumer products business, thought it was an absolutely terrible idea. Had I heeded his advice, we wouldn't be chatting here today. But, equally, it's some of that feedback that has really informed what the brand and business has ultimately become. So I think it's important not to be too dogmatic too early and say, this is what it is, as if it's God's gift. I think that dialogue with your customers is really, really important and critical to kind of understand what you're building early days.
Wise words, Max. Thank you so much. This was a ton of fun. Really appreciate you coming on.
Likewise. Thanks, David.